Considering shifting from stills to video? Here are your top considerations. This will be a multi-part series on the channel if this video performs well. In part 1 here, we'll do some introductory considerations along with a look at how exposure differs from stills and how ISO, the iris, and shutter speeds are used differently from still photography. Part 2 will cover video camera options, lenses, and camera support and movement tools. Part 3 will cover lighting and grip equipment and how to use it. Making the shift to video from still photography can involve many considerations. While you may have had great success in the creation of beautiful still images, video and a moving image is a very different discipline. And while there are certainly overlaps between them, the gulf of considerations between the two mediums is pretty vast. I'll only scratch the surface of that gulf in this video series. Let's start with a little background. First up, most things associated with professional video are expensive. While still photography has been dominant in both the professional world and as a hobby, professional-level video has only recently become affordable for an amateur to pick up and create imagery that's on a par with what you'd see on broadcast TV and even in the cinema. However, while photography has enjoyed years of amateur development with many companies happy to supply low-cost equipment for the hobbyist, there are still many elements of cinematography that are very expensive. The cost of cameras today varies wildly, with a smartphone at the lower end costing about $30, up to a professional cinema camera that can run well over $50,000. While a professional still photographer might use a lens that costs $500, which is well within the price range of the amateur, professional cinema lenses can cost well over $50,000 and are generally only rented by production companies to suit a given project. This is why the adaptation of still camera lenses is widely used today in many low-cost production scenarios. As the adoption of professional-grade low-cost video cameras has become more common, there are many companies that are creating products that are much lower cost in an effort to cater to the amateur video producer. It's very easy to get caught up in gear acquisition syndrome or gas with video gear, just as it is with still photo gear, but you're more likely to break the bank much sooner with cinema gear. Today, most video producers are creating content that will never be seen on TV or in a cinema. It'll only be seen on a website such as YouTube and most likely viewed on a mobile device such as a smartphone or tablet. This allows the content producer to leverage much lower cost equipment to produce their content. Let's start things off with the exposure triangle: ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. As a still photographer, you use these three settings to control exposure, depth of field, and motion blur. In video, your shutter speed is generally fixed at a specific value. Not always, but it's typical to have it fixed at a value such as a 48th of a second. This is due to the fact that video is exposing multiple frames per second unless you're doing a time lapse. The most typical number of frames per second is 24, and this is typical since motion picture film is generally exposed at 24 frames per second. This is referred to as your frame rate. At 24 frames per second, you're getting a 1/48th of a second as your slowest possible shutter speed, and unless you intend to change your frame rate, which has considerations of its own that I'll cover in a moment, your tools for controlling exposure in the camera are now limited to the lighting setup, the iris, and the camera's ISO setting. While you can shoot at a higher shutter speed than a 48th of a second at 24 frames per second, the look of the footage will be impacted since the motion blur will be different from the native 1/48th of a second. As a general rule, cinematography depends on the use of artificial light to create a specific light level and/or light control elements such as cutters and diffusers and ND gels to control light levels. Typically, a cinematographer will light a scene for a specific f-stop to achieve a specific look and depth of field. While depth of field is mostly restricted to a purely aesthetic purpose in still photography, a very common use for it in cinematography is to force the audience's attention to a specific element within the frame. Changing focus in a shot like this is referred to as racking focus, so it's typically both an aesthetic tool and a narrative tool in filmmaking. Changing the aperture during a shot is also used to augment a film's narrative. Consider this shot in a domestic kitchen. The shot is almost black at the start of it. Then the cinematographer gradually opens the iris up in an effort to simulate how the human eye adjusts quickly to changing light levels, such as going from the dark interior to the much lighter interior by the coffee machine here. You can see that it's the iris being adjusted by how the background elements in the right side of the frame gets softer as the shot lightens and the iris opens. For this reason, cinema lenses will not have click stops on the iris control so that the aperture can be opened and closed smoothly during a given shot. Most digital sensors have a sweet spot in terms of ISO setting where the sensor will perform at its optimum with minimal noise and maximum dynamic range. ISO settings above and below this value are implemented with a circuit that either adds or reduces electrical gain to the sensor, and this creates an image that may be noisier or have reduced dynamic range. As such, many cinematographers will be reluctant to change the ISO on their camera and will stick to a single ISO setting that the camera's manufacturer has stated is the optimum or native ISO setting. For whatever video camera that you use, you should test each ISO setting to see what settings will give you the best results. Some cameras have what is known as a dual native ISO, and this is typically going to be two separate ISO circuits on the sensor that have two different optimum settings. This is typically done to extend the ISO range of the camera and is generally designed to favor low light scenarios. An example of this is the Blackmagic Design Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. It provides a dual native ISO of 400 and 3200. 3200 obviously being intended for use in a low light scenario. Obviously, when the camera is set to 400 ISO and you wish to close the lens down to achieve a deeper focus, you'll have to provide more light to achieve correct exposure. The 3200 ISO allows you to mitigate that situation. Going back to frame rate, as previously stated, 24 FPS is the normal frame rate of actual cinema film. This frame rate became a standard in the late 20s when it was determined to provide both an optimal visual experience with the human eye's persistence of vision, minimizing the amount of film used, as well as providing an optimal rate for syncing with the new sound systems. Television, on the other hand, is typically using either 29.97 or 59.97 frames per second. Obviously, these are very close to 30 and 60 frames per second, and the reason for using a slightly slower frame rate for video is for sound synchronization in broadcast TV. Unless you're shooting for broadcast TV, there is never any reason to use either of those frame rates. You can shoot at 30 or 60 if you're looking to use a higher frame rate than 24 frames per second. The main visual difference you'll get with these is that there'll be less motion blur than you get with 24. Another reason is to use a frame rate that's different from 24 standard is to create slow or fast motion. For example, if I shoot at 48 frames per second and play it back at 24 frames per second, the playback will appear at half speed. If I shoot at 12 frames per second, the footage will have double the speed of normal when played back at 24. You can think of this as time-lapse if that helps. Additionally, bear in mind that your shutter speed minimum will be 1/96th of a second at 48 frames per second and 1/24th of a second when shooting at 12 frames per second. Obviously, you can shoot at a faster shutter speed than those, but those are the minimums that are dictated by your frame rate. As a rule of thumb, you can double your frame rate setting to know what your slowest usable shutter speed will be for that given frame rate. So for example, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you know that your minimum usable shutter speed will be 120th of a second. Okay, that's it for part 1. If I get enough interest with views and likes on this, I'll do a part 2. In that one, I'll cover cameras, camera support options, and lenses as well. So make sure to give the video a like, and sharing it on social media is a huge help as well. Thanks so much for watching, and until the next video, take care.